January 1280 BC. Dawn breaks slowly over the Nile Valley. Mist clings low to the water. The river moves in silence, thick and deliberate, carrying with it the black silt of distant African highlands. Along its banks, farmers step barefoot into soil still damp from the flood. Wooden plows cut shallow lines through earth dark as obsidian. In the distance, the stone outlines of temples catch the first light, vast, immovable, older than memory. A barge drifts northward with the current. Its sail hangs slack in the morning stillness. On its deck, sealed jars of grain rest beneath woven linen covers. Grain, measured, recorded, guarded, the currency of survival. Beyond the fields, beyond the villages of mud brick and reed, colossal statues stare eastward toward a rising sun. Their faces do not age. Their expressions do not soften. For more than 1,000 years before this morning, kings have ruled from this river, and for nearly 2,000 years after, Egypt will endure. Empires will rise and fall beyond its deserts. Cities will burn. Languages will vanish. But here, along this river, something extraordinary will persist. The endurance of ancient Egypt did not begin with pyramids or temples. It began with geography. To the west stretched the Sahara, a vast, shifting barrier of sand and heat. To the east, the Red Sea and rugged desert highlands. To the north, the Mediterranean. To the south, cataracts of granite rock broke the Nile into unnavigable channels. Egypt was not merely a kingdom. It was a corridor, a narrow green artery cutting through inhospitable terrain. Each year, the Nile flooded. The inundation arrived in predictable rhythm, swelling between June and September as monsoon rains fell in the Ethiopian highlands. When the waters receded, they left behind a layer of rich black silt. The Egyptians called their land Kemet, the Black Land, in contrast to the surrounding red land of desert. This natural irrigation system created agricultural stability unmatched in the ancient world. While Mesopotamian farmers fought unpredictable rivers like the Tigris and Euphrates, Egypt's lifeline arrived with reliable generosity. Crops could be forecast. Surplus could be stored. Population could grow. Stability became the foundation of statecraft. By roughly 3100 BCE, settlements along Upper and Lower Egypt had grown into competing regional powers. Trade moved along the river. Religious centers formed around local deities. Gradually, conflict and consolidation followed. Then came a ruler historians identify as Narmer, the Narmer palette. A ceremonial stone artifact discovered in the 19th century depicts a king wearing both the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt. It shows an act of symbolic domination, the unification of two lands into one kingdom. Whether Narmer conquered through war or diplomacy remains debated. What is clear is that by the early First Dynasty, Egypt was politically unified under a single monarch. This unification was not merely administrative. It was ideological. The king was not simply a war leader. He was divine. From the earliest dynasties, the Egyptian ruler embodied Horus, the falcon god of kingship. Upon death, he became associated with Osiris, lord of the afterlife. The concept of Ma'at, cosmic balance and order, became central. The pharaoh did not rule by force alone. He maintained harmony between gods, nature, and humanity. In a landscape dependent on seasonal precision, cosmic order was not abstract theology. It was survival. Administration quickly followed theology. To manage irrigation, harvest, labor, and taxation, scribes recorded yields on papyrus. Officials oversaw grain storage. Regional governors, later known as nomarchs, managed provinces called nomes. Bureaucracy emerged as one of Egypt's most powerful tools. Grain became the silent symbol of power. In years of strong flood, surplus filled state granaries. In lean years, redistribution prevented famine. The pharaoh's legitimacy rested not only in temples, but in the ability to feed the population. By the Old Kingdom, beginning around 2686 BC, this system matured into one of the most centralized states of the ancient world. Monumental architecture followed. Under the Fourth Dynasty, rulers such as Khufu commissioned structures that still define Egypt's image today: the pyramids at Giza, These were not built by slaves in chains, as once believed, but by organized labor forces supported by state rations. Archaeological evidence shows workers' villages, bakeries, and medical care facilities. The pyramids were political theology in stone. They proclaimed permanence. They embodied cosmic order. They demonstrated administrative reach. Yet even in this age of grandeur, fragility existed beneath the surface. Toward the end of the Old Kingdom, centralized authority weakened. Regional governors gained autonomy. Nile floods became less predictable. Around 2200 BCE, a period of climatic fluctuation may have reduced agricultural output. Grain shortages undermined royal authority. The first intermediate period followed, a time of fragmentation. Egypt did not collapse entirely. Local rulers continued governance. Art and literature evolved. But unity fractured. What followed would reveal the deeper strength of the Egyptian system. Because Egypt did not simply survive crisis, it reassembled itself. In Thebes, rulers of Upper Egypt gradually extended control northward. By around 2055 BCE, Mentuhotep II reunified the country, inaugurating the Middle Kingdom. Central authority returned, but lessons had been learned. Provincial power was balanced more carefully. Military organization improved. Fortifications appeared along vulnerable borders. This was no longer a fragile pyramid state. It was a resilient civilization. The Nile continued its cycles. Grain continued to fill storage chambers. Temples expanded. Trade reached Nubia for gold, the Levant for timber, and Punt for incense. Egypt's endurance was not accidental. It was engineered by geography, ideology, and administration working in unison. And yet, beyond the deserts, new forces were gathering. Peoples with horses and composite bows. Kingdoms rising in Mesopotamia. Technologies evolving. Egypt would soon face challenges unlike any before. By the late Middle Kingdom, Egypt appeared stable once more. Fortresses lined the Nile's southern frontier in Nubia. Trade expeditions moved with confidence into Levant. Temples grew wealthier. Grain quotas were measured with mathematical precision. The machinery of state seemed secure, but stability in the ancient world was never permanent. Around 1700 BCE, during the decline of the Middle Kingdom, Egypt's eastern delta became increasingly vulnerable. Into this region came a people later known as the Hyksos, a term derived from the Egyptian Hika-Kasut, meaning rulers of foreign lands. Their origins likely traced to Canaanite populations from the Levant. They did not arrive as a single invading army. They entered gradually, settling, trading, and eventually asserting political control. For the first time since unification under Narmer, Egypt was ruled in part by outsiders. The Hyksos established their capital at Avaris in the Nile Delta. They adopted Egyptian titles. They worshipped local gods. Yet they also introduced technologies that transformed warfare in the Nile Valley. The horse-drawn chariot, advanced composite bows, and new bronze weapon designs. Egypt had long relied on infantry and river mobility. Now, mobility itself had changed. The period that followed, known as the Second Intermediate Period, was not one of total collapse, but a divided authority. Hyksos rulers governed Lower Egypt. Native Egyptian dynasties retained control in Thebes to the south. It was in Thebes that resistance formed. 17 dynasty rulers began a determined campaign to expel the Hyksos. Among them, Seqenenre died violently, likely in battle. His successor, Kamose, intensified the struggle. Finally, around 1550 BCE, Ahmose captured Avaris and drove the Hyksos from Egypt entirely. This victory did more than restore sovereignty. It reshaped Egyptian identity. The humiliation of foreign rule hardened political ideology. Pharaoh was no longer merely guardian of Maat within Egypt's borders. He became defender against chaos beyond them. The new kingdom was born from this realization. Beginning around 1550 BCE, Egypt entered its most expansive and militarized era. The Nile was no longer a sufficient boundary. Campaigns pushed deep into Nubia to secure gold mines and manpower. Armies marched north into Syria and Canaan to create buffer zones against emerging powers like Mitanni and later the Hittites. Under rulers such as Thutmose III, often called Napoleon of Egypt, the kingdom expanded into an empire. Military records inscribed on temple walls describe campaigns at Megiddo and beyond. Lists of tribute detail silver, lapis lazuli, horses, and grain. Grain remained central. With imperial expansion came wealth. Foreign tribute supplemented domestic agriculture. State granaries grew larger. Bureaucratic oversight became more complex. Scribes recorded spoils and redistributed resources across temple networks and military garrisons. Egypt had adapted. Where once isolation preserved stability, now projection of power ensured it. Religion also evolved in scale and ambition. The god Ammonius of Thebes rose to prominence, merged with the solar deity Ra into Ammonius Ra. Temples at Karnak expanded into vast ritual complexes supported by agricultural estates. Yet success carried unintended consequences. Temple institutions accumulated immense landholdings and wealth. Priesthoods gained influence that rivaled royal authority. Power, once concentrated entirely in the pharaoh, became diffused through religious and military elites. Then, in the 14th century BCE, one ruler attempted to alter the very foundation of Egyptian belief. Akhenaten abandoned traditional polytheism and elevated the Aten, the sun disk, above all other gods. He moved the capital to a newly built city, Akhetaten. Artistic styles shifted toward intimate, almost fragile representations of royal life. It was a revolution not only of theology, but of identity. Yet it proved short-lived. After his death, traditional worship was restored. His successor, the young Tutankhamun, reinstated the old gods. Akhenaten's monuments were dismantled. His name was erased from king lists. Egypt's system had rejected radical deviation. Continuity prevailed over innovation. By the reign of Ramesses II in the 13th century BCE, Egypt stood at the height of monumental grandeur. His long rule saw vast construction projects and military confrontations, including the famous Battle of Kadesh against the Hittite Empire, one of the earliest recorded battles in detailed relief inscriptions. Though Egyptian records portray victory, modern historians recognize the battle as tactically indecisive. Yet what followed was unprecedented. A formal peace treaty between Egypt and the Hittites, preserved in both Egyptian hieroglyphs and Akkadian cuneiform. Diplomacy joined warfare as an instrument of survival. But even imperial strength has limits. By the late 12th century BCE, a wave of upheaval swept across the eastern Mediterranean. Often referred to as the Bronze Age collapse. Trade networks faltered. Kingdoms fell. Maritime raiders known in Egyptian texts as the Sea Peoples attacked coastal regions. Egypt repelled these incursions under Ramesses III, but at enormous cost. Economic strain deepened. Foreign territories were lost. Central authority weakened once again. Over the next centuries, Egypt would face Libyan dynasties, Nubian kings from Kush, Assyrian invasions, and Persian conquest. Each time its sovereignty bent. Each time its institutions adapted. The question was no longer whether Egypt could survive disruption. The question was how long its foundations, geography, grain, divine kingship, and administrative order, could withstand an increasingly interconnected and volatile world. The answer would unfold across centuries of resilience and gradual erosion. Egypt's survival across 3 millennia cannot be explained by chronology alone. It must be understood through the forces that sustained it: geographic, human, ideological, and structural. The first and most enduring of these was the Nile itself. The river was not simply a waterway. It was a calendar, a clock, a measuring instrument of destiny. Each inundation brought renewal. Each recession exposed soil capable of feeding millions. Unlike other ancient civilizations dependent on erratic rainfall or volatile rivers, Egypt possessed predictability. That predictability allowed planning. Planning allowed surplus. Surplus allowed state formation. Grain was the quiet architecture beneath the monuments. Archaeological records from granaries and administrative papyri show detailed accounting systems tracking harvest levels and labor obligations. During high floods, state granaries swelled. During low floods, stored reserves prevented widespread famine. Control of grain equaled control of legitimacy. A pharaoh who fed his people upheld might. Divine order made material. Geography also insulated Egypt from sudden annihilation. The Sahara formed a natural defensive barrier. Invasions required logistical endurance through desert corridors or navigation via the delta. This relative isolation reduced the frequency of catastrophic conquest during early periods. Stability became cultural memory. Generations lived without witnessing the total collapse seen elsewhere. Yet geography alone cannot sustain a civilization. The second sustaining force was ideology. The divine authority of the pharaoh. Egyptian kingship was not symbolic monarchy. It was cosmic necessity. The ruler embodied Horus in life and Osiris in death. His duty was not merely political governance, but maintenance of universal balance. Temple reliefs depict pharaohs smiting enemies, offering grain to gods, receiving life from divine hands. These were not exaggerated boasts. They were theological affirmations. This belief system created cohesion. Subjects did not merely obey. They participated in a sacred order. Taxes became offerings. Labor became devotion. Even monumental construction, pyramids, temples, obelisks, reinforced a worldview where permanence was achievable through alignment with divine law. The third sustaining force was administration. Egypt developed one of the earliest complex bureaucracies in recorded history. Scribes trained for years in hieratic script. Surveyors recalculated field boundaries after each flood. Officials recorded livestock counts, census data, and storage tallies. This administrative continuity endured even during political fragmentation. When dynasties fell, scribes remained. When foreign rulers took the throne, they adopted Egyptian titulary and relied on existing administrative frameworks. The system outlived individual kings. The fourth sustaining force was adaptability in warfare. Before the Hyksos, Egyptian armies were largely infantry-based. After expelling them, Egypt adopted the chariot and composite bow. Military innovation became institutionalized. Campaign inscriptions of Thutmose III describe logistical planning, siege tactics, and coordinated advances. Egypt transformed from a river kingdom into a territorial empire. Adaptation replaced complacency. The fifth sustaining force was religion's flexibility within continuity. Despite moments of upheaval, such as the Aten experiment under Akhenaten, the broader religious structure absorbed and reinterpreted change. New deities rose in prominence. Older ones merged or shifted roles. Ammonius became Ammonius Ra. Local gods integrated into state theology. This elasticity allowed unity without rigidity. Egypt did not resist change entirely. It moderated it. And yet, beneath these sustaining forces, tensions accumulated. Temple wealth grew immense during the New Kingdom. Priesthoods controlled agricultural estates, rivaling royal domains. Military commanders gained influence through foreign campaigns. Economic reliance on tribute increased vulnerability when expansion slowed. Grain remained abundant along the Nile, but empire required more than harvests. It required constant projection of power. When external pressures intensified during the Late Bronze Age, Egypt found itself defending extended borders rather than secure frontiers. Ramesses III's inscriptions recount battles against the Sea Peoples, listing captured ships and defeated warriors. Relief carvings at Medinet Habu depict naval engagements with striking clarity. Egypt survived the assault, but the cost weakened its imperial reach. Gradually, authority decentralized again. Libyan chiefs settled in the Delta and founded dynasties. Nubian rulers from Kush adopted Egyptian customs and ruled as pharaohs. Assyrian forces under Esarhaddon and Ashur-banipal invaded in the 7th century BCE. Persian kings later incorporated Egypt into their empire. Yet even under foreign domination, Egyptian identity persisted. Temples continued rituals. Scribes wrote in hieroglyphs and demotic script. Farmers sowed grain after each flood. The Nile rose and fell as it always had. This continuity raises a deeper question. Was Egypt's endurance a triumph of strength or a testament to its ability to absorb conquest without dissolving? To answer that, one must examine not just the sustaining forces, but the human and structural dynamics that operated beneath them. Another angle of Egypt's endurance lies in its relationship with time. Most civilizations measure themselves through dynasties and wars. Egypt measured itself through eternity. Monuments were constructed not for decades, but for the afterlife. Stone replaced mud brick when permanence mattered. Hieroglyphs were carved deep into granite so that names would not erode. The very concept of history in Egypt differed from that of later empires. Kings did not merely rule in sequence. They upheld an unbroken chain stretching back to divine origins. King lists inscribed on temple walls recorded predecessors as part of sacred continuity. Even when political fragmentation occurred, later rulers often retroactively legitimized themselves by linking their reigns to earlier dynasties. Continuity was curated deliberately. This long memory stabilized identity. While Mesopotamian city-states rose and vanished under new names, Egypt remained the two lands. Its symbolism, the white crown of Upper Egypt, the red crown of Lower Egypt, endured for millennia. The imagery of smiting enemies, of presenting grain to gods, of receiving the ank of life, repeated across centuries with subtle variation. Grain again becomes central in this angle. Harvest scenes painted in tombs show laborers cutting wheat with flint sickles, oxen threshing stalks, scribes tallying sacks. These images were not decorative. They were assurances of eternal provision. The afterlife itself was imagined as fertile fields, the field of reeds, mirroring the Nile Valley. Agriculture shaped both economy and metaphysics. A second human angle involved social structure. Egyptian society was hierarchical, yet interdependent. At the top stood the pharaoh. Beneath him, nobles, priests, and military officials. Scribes occupied a privileged intellectual class. Artisans and laborers formed the skilled backbone of monumental construction. Farmers composed the majority. Unlike some ancient societies, Egypt allowed limited social mobility through scribal education. Instructional texts such as the Satire of the Trades praised the life of the scribe above manual labor. Literacy became a pathway to administrative authority. This administrative literacy created resilience. When regimes shifted, bureaucrats maintained continuity. Foreign rulers, including Nubian kings and Persian satraps, quickly learned that governing Egypt required mastering its scribal apparatus. Another angle lies in foreign integration. Egypt was rarely annihilated. It was absorbed and absorbing. When the Kushite rulers of the 25th dynasty conquered Egypt in the 8th century BCE, they adopted pharaonic titulary and revived archaic artistic styles. When Persian kings like Cambyses II took control in 525 BCE, they presented themselves as legitimate pharaohs in temple inscriptions. Foreign dominion did not erase Egyptian identity. It layered over it. This pattern reached a new phase with the arrival of Alexander the Great in 332 BC. Unlike earlier invaders, Alexander did not merely claim the throne. He embraced Egyptian divinity, visiting the oracle of Ammonius at Siwa, where he was proclaimed son of the god. After his death, his general Ptolemy established a dynasty that blended Greek and Egyptian traditions. The Ptolemies ruled from Alexandria, a Hellenistic metropolis on the Mediterranean. Yet they maintained temple construction along the Nile. Hieroglyphs continued. Priestly hierarchies remained intact. Greek became the language of administration in urban centers, but rural Egypt preserved older traditions. Dual identity became a survival strategy. Yet another angle involves environmental constancy and eventual vulnerability. For centuries, the Nile's flooding pattern remained relatively stable. However, paleoclimatic studies suggest fluctuations during certain transitional periods. Lower flood levels correlated with political instability in both the Old Kingdom and later eras. While Egypt benefited from relative predictability, it was never immune to environmental stress. A civilization built on one river carried inherent risk. Finally, there's the angle of gradual erosion rather than dramatic collapse. Egypt did not fall in a single cataclysmic moment like some later empires. Its decline was incremental. Territorial losses accumulated. Foreign mercenaries replaced native soldiers. Economic pressures mounted as Mediterranean trade networks shifted. By the time Cleopatra VII ruled in the 1st century BCE, Egypt remained wealthy in grain, but politically entangled in Roman power struggles. The Nile still flooded. Farmers still harvested. Temples still conducted rites. But sovereignty had narrowed. When Octavian defeated Cleopatra and Mark Antony at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, Egypt did not burn. It did not shatter. It transitioned. In 30 BCE, Egypt became a province of Rome. Pharaohs ceased. Roman prefects governed. Grain shipments flowed northward to feed the growing capital on the Tiber. The same grain that once legitimized divine kings now sustain an empire across the sea. This final transformation invites the decisive question: when did Egypt truly end? Was it with foreign conquest? With the death of Cleopatra? With the closing of pagan temples centuries later? Or did Egypt endure in language, ritual, and memory far beyond the fall of its last native ruler? To approach that answer, we must now enter the moments when everything seemed poised either for permanence or for unraveling. The final turning point did not arrive with thunder or flame. It unfolded slowly, across generations, as sovereignty narrowed and the center of gravity shifted beyond the Nile. After the retreat from imperial territories in Levant, Egypt entered what historians call the Third Intermediate Period. Power fractured between Tanis in the north and Thebes in the south. High priest Ammonius controlled Upper Egypt's wealth, while Libyan-origin military leaders established ruling dynasties in the delta. Authority no longer radiated cleanly from a single throne. Grain still filled state granaries. The Nile still flooded with measured rhythm. But political unity had become conditional. In the 8th century BCE, a new power rose from the south. The kingdom of Kush, centered at Napata in Nubia, advanced northward. Its rulers did not seek to erase Egypt. They sought to restore it. Kushite kings adopted full pharaonic titulary, revived archaic artistic forms, and presented themselves as guardians of tradition. The 25th dynasty was foreign in origin, yet deeply Egyptian in presentation. This pattern repeated with greater violence in the 7th century BCE, when the Neo-Assyrian Empire expanded westward. Armies under Esarhaddon invaded in 671 BCE, capturing Memphis. Later campaigns under Ashurbanipal sacked Thebes in 663 BCE. Egyptian inscriptions grew quieter. Assyrian records were blunt. For the first time, Egypt faced an empire whose scale surpassed its own. Though local rulers regained limited autonomy under the 26th dynasty, sovereignty was increasingly precarious. In 525 BCE, the Persian king Cambyses II defeated Pharaoh Psamtik III at the Battle of Pelusium. Egypt became a satrapy of the Achaemenid Empire. Persian rulers adopted pharaonic titles and temple inscriptions, but ultimate authority lay elsewhere. Once again, grain shipments flowed outward. Temples continued rituals. Farmers continued planting. Administrative papyri continued recording taxes. Yet Egypt's political destiny was no longer self-directed. Then, in 332 BCE, Alexander the Great entered Egypt without major resistance. Persian rule had grown unpopular. Alexander was welcomed as liberator. At Siwa Oasis, priests of Ammonius recognized him as son of the god. He founded Alexandria on the Mediterranean coast, a city that would eclipse older capitals in cultural influence. After his death, his general Ptolemy secured Egypt, inaugurating the Ptolemaic dynasty. For nearly 3 centuries, Greek-speaking rulers governed a largely Egyptian population. They maintained temple construction along the Nile, inscribing decrees in hieroglyphs Demotic and Greek. The Rosetta Stone, carved in 196 BCE under Ptolemy V, exemplifies this trilingual governance. Egypt became both Hellenistic kingdom and ancient land. Alexandria flourished as intellectual center. The library in Malsion attracted scholars from across the Mediterranean. Maritime trade expanded, yet rural Egypt remained anchored to its river rhythms. Grain exports increased, feeding markets abroad. By the 1st century BCE, Rome had become the dominant Mediterranean power. Internal dynastic conflict weakened the Ptolemaic court. When Cleopatra VII ascended the throne in 51 BCE, she inherited wealth but not stability. Cleopatra maneuvered within Roman civil wars, aligning first with Julius Caesar, then with Mark Antony. Egypt's fleet and treasury became entangled in Rome's struggle for supremacy. The decisive moment came at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, where Octavian's forces defeated Antony and Cleopatra's combined navy. The following year, Octavian annexed Egypt. In 30 BCE, Egypt ceased to be an independent kingdom for the first time since unification over 3,000 years earlier. It became the personal province of Octavian. Roman prefects governed. Senators were forbidden from entering, without imperial permission. Egypt's grain supply became essential to feeding Rome's population. The symbolic shift was profound. For millennia, grain had legitimized divine kingship along the Nile. Now it sustained a republic-turned-empire across the sea. The Nile's abundance no longer underwrote pharaonic eternity. It reinforced Roman imperial stability. Yet Egypt did not vanish. Temples continued functioning for centuries under Roman rule. Priests carved hieroglyphs into stone as late as the 4th century CE. Traditional cults endured until the gradual spread of Christianity and imperial edicts closed pagan sanctuaries. The end was not explosive. It was cumulative. A civilization that lasted 3,000 years did not fall in a single battle. It transformed, absorbed, and redefined itself repeatedly until its political form dissolved into a larger imperial framework. And still, the Nile flowed. For 3,000 years, the Nile rose and fell. Empires gathered at its edges. Armies crossed its borders. Foreign kings placed their names inside cartouches and called themselves pharaoh. Yet the river endured its rhythm, patient, seasonal, indifferent to the ambitions of men. Ancient Egypt did not survive because it was invincible. It survived because it was structured around continuity. Geography offered protection. Grain offered stability. Administration offered memory. Religion offered meaning. Each flood renewed not only the soil, but the belief that order could be restored. Other civilizations burned brightly and vanished. Egypt faded slowly, layer by layer, absorbed into larger systems without losing its internal coherence. Even under Persian, Greek, and Roman rule, temples continued their rites. Farmers still pressed seed into black earth. Scribes still counted harvests. Its final political end in 30 BCE marked the conclusion of pharaonic sovereignty, but not the erasure of identity. Egyptian language survived in Coptic. Architectural forms influenced later cultures. The concept of divine kingship echoed in distant courts. The pyramids remained, casting shadows across centuries that no conqueror could dismantle. The true answer to how Egypt lasted 3,000 years lies not in a single ruler or battle. It lies in alignment. Alignment between river and field, between ruler and ritual, between administration and abundance. A civilization that synchronizes itself with predictable forces can outlast storms that destroy others. And yet, permanence is never absolute. Even the Nile's floods would eventually change with modern dams. Even temples would fall silent. The illusion of eternity gives way, always, to time. Still, in the long arc of human history, few societies have sustained coherence as long as Egypt. It stands as evidence that resilience is not merely strength. It is adaptation guided by memory. Stone may erode, dynasties may end,